I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce my colleague and dear friend, Wade Hollingshaus, and I can tell you that you're in for a treat. Um, uh, Wade Hollingshaus is an associate professor in Brigham Young University's Department of Theater and Media Arts. He teaches courses in theater history, theory, and criticism, and is head of dramaturgy studies. He holds an MA in Scandinavian Studies from the University of Washington and a PhD in theater historiography and performance studies from the University of Minnesota. His research is located primarily in the new field of performance philosophy, where he explores politico-materialist critiques of various performance sites as they function in neoliberal environments. He also researches and teaches Finnish literature and theater. He has been published in Theater Topics, Scandinavian Studies, Review, the Journal of Dramaturgy, the Journal of Religion and Theater, the Journal of Finnish Studies, TDR, Theater Journal, and Ecumenica. In 2013, he published his first book, Philosophizing Rock Performance, Dylan, Hendrix, Bowie. He occasionally works as a professional dramaturg for Pioneer Theater Company in Salt Lake City, and he recently completed a 3-year term as the chair of the National Playwriting Program for the Southwest region of the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival. He is happily married to Janine Hollingshaus and has 5 children. Wade.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks to everybody who's here today. I'm just going to start. It is common in our world, a world saturated by media, to hear that media themselves are neither good nor bad. We hear that while the objects that media produce, stories, messages, images, sounds, etc., may, intended or not, have good or bad effects on us and our world, good and bad are not inherent characteristics of the media. I believe this. On the other hand, while I believe that media are neither good nor bad, I also do not believe that media are neutral. To be sure, I'm not alone in pointing to the non-neutrality of media. Marshall McLuhan's work in the 60s is perhaps the most famous enunciation of media non-neutrality. And in the decades since, many have continued, modified, and reframed the non-neutrality argument. Levi Bryant, in his 2014 work on machine-oriented ontology, stated quite strongly how media, or more generally any technology, tool, or object, have profound effects on the ones who use them. He explains that the materials used in designing any product come with their own exigencies for the design. And in the next breath, Bryant states, quote, "But it is also that these materials design us to the same degree that we form them," end quote. In this, Bryant reconfigures the usual schema for thinking about the relationship between subjects, media, and objects. The typical schema looks something like this. We to media to message. On the other hand, the schema we get from Bryant, which is the schema that I want to advance with my remarks today, looks more like this. The non-neutrality of media, in the way that I want to address it today, means that while we use media to generate various message products, we too are a product of our encounter with media. Media generate products on both ends. I mention Bryant here simply because he is the most recent that I have come across who argues for a non-neutrality position, and because he so succinctly summarizes my own sentiments. However, rather than approach the non-neutrality position using Bryant's own brand of speculative realism philosophy, I want to discuss it through the post-structuralist concept of gesture. As articulated separately by Giorgio Agamben and Jean-François Lyotard. My intention this morning is to present a summary of how each of these thinkers posits gesture and then synthesize those positions into a singular definition. I will then demonstrate the utility of the concept of gesture for understanding how media effectively subjectivize those who use them. I will do this first by exploring the gesture that Bob Dylan extended at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival when he infamously went electric. Second, I will, in much more broad strokes, suggest some of the gestures being extended through current use of the social media Twitter. In explaining gesture, Giorgio Agamben draws upon the work of the ancient Roman philosopher Varro. Varro introduces us to three different concepts: which Agamben identifies as poiesis, praxis, and gesture. Poiesis, he writes, is a means with the end in view. Let's take a play, for example. If I'm going to write a play, I want to think about how I'm going to craft the play in order to communicate what I want to communicate. So I have an end in view of what I want the audience to take away from it. And then I go about employing the different means at my disposal as an artist to achieve that end. In painting, we use different means than we do in novel writing. But each of the arts has its own respective means, and the artists utilize those means towards a specific end. We call this poiesis. And if we think about Aristotle's Poetics, that's what he's analyzing. He's giving a breakdown of the different means that the playwright uses to achieve his end. The second of the three concepts is praxis. Praxis is an end without means. For example, we do good because doing good is its own end. We don't necessarily need to do good as a means to achieve something else. Rather, we do it because that's what we should do. Praxis, then, is the idea of a virtue. And if poiesis indicates a means to an end, and praxis indicates an end without means, then gesture is a means without end. Gesture refers to just the means themselves, without any purpose behind them. It refers to a pure mediality. Elsewhere in his writing, Agamben categorizes gesture as communication of a communicability. He recognizes that with every work of art, but also with every action or utterance, or what we can refer to as a performance, a gesture is extended through that performance. What this means is that with every communication, there is a set of conditions that make the communication possible, and to be such as it is. And also that the act of the communication doesn't just communicate the content of the communication, but it also communicates those conditions of possibility. Lyotard. A second valence of gesture is provided by one of Agamben's contemporaries. Lyotard's ideas on gesture come from an essay published in his book, Postmodern Fables. As the title of the essay indicates, the title being Music, Mutic, Lyotard develops his thoughts in the context of music. But he does point out that gesture is not exclusive to music. It is equally applicable to film, television, theater, sculpture, etc. Essentially speaking, if one can use that phrase when discussing Lyotard, he posits that gesture is a collusion of time and space that is extended and reified through any performative moment. And as he addresses music, he argues that sound is a part of the space-time collusion. A musical performance, he explains, activates a certain spatio-temporal existence for the audience through the way that it utilizes its sound component. Lyotard is thus talking about a space-time sound, and he posits that the space-time sound is organized for the hearer by something exterior to the sound matter, but that it is nonetheless heard by the audience. When we listen to music, we hear the sound that's being transmitted, but we also hear something that we don't necessarily recognize, but that is sitting exterior to the sound matter, and that directs our experience with that sound matter, something that allows us to hear something, or to hear some things, as the somethings that we hear. Lyotard calls this extrasonic exteriority the mutic. Just to give you one quick example of how the mutic functions. Some of you may have had an experience in which you come across a new song that not many others have heard of, and you really love it. And then suddenly it blows up. It's being played everywhere, and everybody knows it, and now you don't like the song as much. And it's not because the sounds of the song have changed at all. They're fixed. But there is something outside of the sounds, the mutic, that's changed, and that shifts how you hear those sounds. You actually hear the sounds differently. It changes the way you encounter them. Now, that's one aspect of something much, much larger that Lyotard's talking about, but it gives you just kind of a sample of what's happening. The sonic material is the music. The extrasonic exteriority is the mutic, the thing outside, or the gesture. But while the mutic refers specifically to music performances, gesture, which comprises the mutic, is not limited to music or its performances. As far as Lyotard is concerned, gesture works through visuality just the same, inasmuch as there is something exterior to the materiality of the performance, but that conditions how we receive the performance. It situates us towards receiving future performances similarly or differently. We could say then that it's the same as when Agamben says the communication of a communicability. Okay, so let me kind of singularize this. While keeping Agamben and Lyotard in mind, what I now want to present is a definition of gesture as a subjectivizing force in the world. To say that the performance of a gesture subjectivizes is not to imply that the act of subjectivization is an instance that adds additional ways of being in the world to an already existing menu of behavior options for the subjects. It doesn't say, hey, here's yet one more subjectivity we can embrace if we want to. Takers, anyone? Such does not really capture what is meant by subjectivization. Subjectivization means that the subjects are produced, one way or another, by virtue of the conditions that the performance delimits and ushers forth. Through the gesture of the performance, the subjects are interpolated into a system that delimits the possibilities of their behavior as one type of subject or another. Included in this is how the subjects perceive themselves as subjects. And I want to emphasize this point. One of the behaviors that potentially becomes delimited by the subjectivization that is gesture is the perception of self, as an other, as whatever. How one perceives anything as anything is contingent upon the delimiting factors of the gesture. Moreover, what one does with those perceptions, how one aligns them with other perceptions, or even how one does not align them with other perceptions, how one directs those perceptions toward one end or another. All of these possible outlets of behavior are delimited to some extent by the gesture. And it is precisely the movement of the mind into any combination of these outlets that is what typically becomes identified as thinking. Okay, so Bob Dylan. I'll say more about thinking in a bit, but let's look at Bob Dylan and then at Twitter. I want to provide an example of how a gesture of media functioned relative to what is probably the most famous event in Bob Dylan's career. That evening in 1965 at the Newport Folk Festival, when, as it is commonly referred to, Dylan goes electric. I'm often surprised, though I really probably shouldn't be, but I'm often surprised at how many of my students have no idea about Bob Dylan in the 1960s. Some of you know this well. Some of you lived through it. Some of you may have even been there. But for those who don't know this history, I'll provide a thumbnail sketch of the event. But then what I want to do is actually provide a slightly different reading of that event vis-a-vis the concept of gesture. In the summer of 1963, when Dylan made his first appearance at the Newport Folk Festival, he was a relatively unknown figure in the New York area folk music circuit. It was during his time at the '63 festival, that very first year, when he came as a guest of folk darling Joan Baez. It was that year that people began to take notice of Dylan as a prescient, fresh, young voice on the folk scene, solidified by a beautiful moment near the end of the festival when Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and others joined Dylan in a moving performance of his Blowin' in the Wind. By the time of his 1964 festival appearance, Dylan had become the poster child for the youth/folk movement. They're connected movements, but we can talk about them separately, the youth movement and the folk movement. Even though he adamantly, and Dylan protested that he had anything to do with either of these movements, and he still protests that today. So by the time that he showed up for the '65 festival, he was the biggest thing in folk music, the premier attraction at the festival, and labeled by many as the voice of his generation. Everyone was clamoring to hear Dylan perform. They all expected him to come out on stage with his acoustic guitar and a harmonica and perform deeply poetic folk songs. Instead, when Dylan took the stage, he had in his hands an electric guitar and was flanked by an electric blues band. And rather than play his folk masterpiece, Blowin' in the Wind, or something similar, Dylan, dressed in a black leather jacket, began to blast out electric rock and roll. It's difficult to determine exactly what the audience reaction was. I'm going to sneeze. Okay. There are those who were in attendance who were on board with Dylan and loved it. But most accounts of the evening relate that audience reaction was quite negative. In Martin Scorsese's documentary on Dylan, he ramps up the audio on the audience track, and you can clearly hear boos rising up from the crowd. Immediately, that performance became a moment of great controversy in the folk community. And it has become one of the most controversial moments in the history of popular music in the United States. Soon after that Newport performance, Dylan went on tour. For those tour performances, he would play an acoustic set, and then he would play an electric set. During the acoustic set, the audience would cheer, applaud, and sing along, and during the electric set, they would boo and hiss and yell epithets like traitor and Judas. For most in the folk community, Dylan had become a traitor. He had abandoned the ethos of the people who had been supporting him. He went to join the dark side and sold out to rock and roll. Now, that's the way the story is generally talked about and understood. And I don't want to suggest in my rereading that there weren't people who took offense to the fact that there was an electric guitar on a folk festival stage. However, we also have to remember that this was not at all the first time electric guitars were used at the Newport Folk Festival, nor was it the first time Dylan used electric guitars in his music. On his earlier albums, there are a few songs on which he played electric guitars. Now, it may be the first time that Bob Dylan had an electric guitar on a folk stage, and I get that. But it seems clear to me that there's also something else that's going on here. I want to begin an examination of that something else by pointing to a statement that Al Kooper made about what happened at Newport in '65. Al Kooper played the organ during the recording of Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. This track was recorded earlier in 1965, and it actually hit the airwaves a week or so before the Newport performance. And Kooper and the guitarist on the recording, Mike Bloomfield, were there with Dylan in Newport. Years later, when asked about the Newport performance, Kooper says something really important. He said that the day before Dylan was supposed to perform, he came to Kooper and told him, "Hey, I want to recreate what we did on the album." Now, that's maybe just a thrown-away comment, but I think that there is something deeply significant here that indicates how Dylan's subjectivity had shifted, because that comment does not represent the mentality of a folk musician. The tradition of folk music performance is that folk musicians either write songs and perform them, or they perform traditional songs from the folk repertoire. But in either case, the primary artistic object for the folk musician is the live musical performance, a communal event. Folk musicians would sometimes record themselves singing songs, but these album recordings were more a kind of advertisement for the musician, who hoped people would like what they heard and want to come and see the musician play. And truth be told, the first folk recordings were those made by folk historians, who would scour the Appalachians and surrounding countryside to find and preserve American roots music. This idea of folk recordings as a means to preserve the past is also part of what justified the recording of contemporary folk musicians like Dylan. But again, for the folk musician, the live performance is the primary artistic object. But this is not what was at the heart of what Dylan was saying to Kooper. Dylan was thinking differently about the relationship between the live performance and the recording. He was not thinking of the recording as somehow secondary to the live performance, but rather he was beginning to regard the recording as the primary artistic object. Excuse me for a second. Okay, so he was starting to think of the recording as the primary artistic object as opposed to folk musicians for whom the live performance is what they do. This move is one that would become more pronounced among rock bands in the 1970s and would later pretty much dominate the popular music industry. Artists would record albums and then conduct a live tour to promote that album, the recording being the primary and the live performance secondary. In fact, that is what Theodore Graysick identifies as the very definition of a rock musician, as opposed to a folk musician. Folk musicians sing songs, rock musicians make recordings. And if we look at the way that Dylan worked on his albums prior to 1965, and then from 65 on, we can see that this is the trajectory that Dylan was following. For his first albums, Dylan would go into the studio and sing each song once, maybe twice, and that was it. He and the producers would complete the entire album in a day. While working on Like a Rolling Stone, they spent multiple recording days on that one song. They would record, make changes to the instrumentation, re-record, make further changes, re-record, edit and alter sounds, maybe re-record, and then piece together the final track from numerous instances of recording. For Like a Rolling Stone, Dylan was using the studio not just to record a track, but to craft one. Dylan had become a rock artist. Again, a bit of a 1965 timeline here. Dylan records Like a Rolling Stone, it begins to get radio play, and then Dylan arrives at Newport. Dylan's approach to that Newport performance is not as a folk musician who will sing a song, but as a rock musician who is going to refer his audience to a recording that he has already made. Through this performance, Dylan effectively flips the spatiotemporal existence of the folk audience member. I lost my place. With this performance, Dylan extends a gesture that ushers in a new spatiotemporal existence, one that is not about preserving the past, but about anticipating the future. By privileging the recording, Dylan is in effect privileging the future, a new subjective condition of being in the world. I'm going to extrapolate on this, but I want to do so by pointing to something that happened in Dylan's life that had already acclimated him to this new spatiotemporal experience, this new subjectivity, that he in the summer of '65 extended as a gesture to his folk audience. Just prior to his studio recording of Like a Rolling Stone, Dylan had been touring England, and during most of that tour had been closely followed everywhere he went by D.A. Pennebaker and his crew who were filming a documentary of that tour. This footage became the film Don't Look Back. For months, Dylan lived his life with the anxiety of knowing that his every move, from the shining to the shameful, was being recorded and would potentially be viewable by anyone and everyone forever. Dylan had interiorized what John Mowat has called the condition of recording. Mowat explains that, and I'm paraphrasing everything here, that the condition of recording brings the moment of reception, a future moment, into the moment of recording. He argues that everything that happens in the moment of recording is being tempered by the moment of reception, the moment when someone will hear that recording. Mowat further posits that because most music we hear today is recorded music, musicians have often transferred the anxiety that occurs in the moment of recording into every moment in which they perform music, even when that music is not being recorded. Musicians have interiorized the condition of recording to the point that, being recorded or not, they are always already being recorded. They live in a constant anticipation of the future. It is this very anxiety that Dylan began to interiorize in England while being followed by Pennebaker's camera, and then continued to experience in the recording studio, and finally took with him onto the Newport stage. And it is this anxiety that Dylan extended as a gesture to the Newport crowd. It was in fact the mutic underpinnings of Dylan's going electric moment. So what I think is at play here is that there is a certain kind of mutic or a certain gesture that Dylan is ushering forth by asking people to experience time differently. The way that maybe I shouldn't say asking, the way that he's experiencing it. U.S. Americans eventually became acclimated to this new subjectivity, but at that time, for the folk audience, there was a traitor in their midst. Dylan was a traitor to the folk ethos, not so much because he played an electric guitar on a folk festival stage, but because he extended a gesture to that audience that brought them face to face with a new, non-folk spatiotemporality. Dylan was inviting his audience to live in a present future rather than in a present past, which is where the folkies lived. Dylan didn't author the gesture, but only extended it, and that's an important part of Leotard's essay, is that gestures are extended through people and things, but that those people and things aren't the authors of them. It's extended. But only extended it, a specific set of conditions that subjectivized his audience into a new spatiotemporality. Some were willing to go along and others resisted, but they couldn't hold out for long, as the increasing ubiquity of recording technologies interpolated all of them, and eventually all of us within the scope of this gesture. With our little phones, where we're recording everything and anything we can, we too live in a spatiotemporality influenced by that historical moment. On the other hand, it's been almost half a decade since Dylan recorded Like a Rolling Stone and performed at Newport, so it would be incorrect to assume that our 2014 subjectivity is precisely the same as the one that followed soon after Dylan's turn. Since then, media have provided us with a number of different gestures that have reshaped subjectivity. In the minutes that I have left, I would like to take a look at Twitter and make some broad strokes toward outlining the gesture or gestures it extends and the recontouring that it provides for our subjectivity. And I think there are a lot of different directions that this could go. I'm going to kind of center it all on this next paragraph. Social media, generally speaking, are rich with gestures, the most prominent of which is the virtual plane of existence that it has manufactured and that has become, even though virtual, a real facet of our subjectivity. The plane is a place of convergence for anyone willing and able in terms of time, instruments, and other resources, to participate in it. And because of the non-neutrality of media, participation comes under certain terms. The terms are not necessarily positive or negative, but they are a real non-neutral force. At the most fundamental level, the social media plane is designed to register certain aspects of subjectivity, providing presence to those and only to those aspects. The various social media platforms may approach this in different ways, providing some levels of variety in subjectivity, but whatever the imperatives, they are imperatives, and thus are non-neutral. In the context of Twitter, there are a number of imperatives that work towards shaping the subjectivity of its users. Let's start with the character limit. The 140 character limit acts as a delimitation of thought for the one drafting a tweet. It means that no thought, which might require more than 140 characters, can be expressed in a single tweet. I need to qualify that quite a bit. The technology of Twitter has essentially determined that thoughts must be less than 140 characters long. On the other hand, the restriction might just mean, and probably has meant, that we will become better at expressing our thoughts more briefly. In many cases, this is not a bad thing. Or if a thought cannot be expressed in less than 140 characters, perhaps language will transform to allow this to happen. The hypertextuality of Twitter already allows for this. However, we must remember that hypertext or no, a thought expressed by two different forms of textuality may not actually be the same thought to those reading the texts.